I'm going to go ahead and get our recorded started and take it from here.
Okay, perfect. So hi, everybody. Welcome to our third alumni career conversation of the semester. So today we're talking to Laura Stateler, who graduated from BC in 2018 with IS in philosophy double major. Laura currently works as a research assistant at Brookings, an education and social policy research organization. So I'll start by asking Laura some questions that I think everybody would be interested in. But after that, I'll open up the floor for you guys to ask any questions that you might have. And if you have any questions that come up during the conversation, feel free to send them to me in the chat, or you can save them for the Q&A. And just so everybody knows, we're recording this conversation so that people unable to make it can watch. Okay, so with that, we can get started. So Laura, could you briefly introduce yourself and maybe tell us a bit about your experience at BC and the jobs you've held and what you're doing right now?
Yeah, thanks for introducing me. And a part of like my path to Brookings does include Professor Krause's research team. So before everyone has to hop off, I can also speak a little bit about that. But yes, my name is Laura. I graduated a couple years ago now, and time has just flown by. At BC, I was a philosophy and international studies major, and I tried to create my major to be like the PPE major, philosophy, political science, and economics. So when I was at BC, it seems like it was the old structure of the international studies major. So my concentration was in political science. So I really liked that in my education at BC, I got a lot of philosophy, which I loved, but then I got the political science and then the economics side. So while I was at BC, I was mainly involved with the Emerging Leader program. That was kind of like my main 4-year involvement at BC, starting as a participant my freshman year, a facilitator my sophomore year, and then a coordinator my senior year. And then another big aspect that I think helped me get to Brookings and land the job I have now is actually Professor Krause's research team, because that was my first experience of like doing a research project as part of a team. And so, as he said, I was an undergraduate research fellow, so I helped oversee and just help manage the process of it all. And so I can speak a little bit about more of like the tangible skills that I think I got from the research team. And the first one was like working directly with Professor Krause, where that really translates to my workflow right now, where I report directly to one scholar at Brookings. And so that was like a helpful model. And it was also just great to see the flow of research, where I think as a student in IS and philosophy, I was just working on short-term papers. So being able to be part of a process was really helpful. And I feel like I was really able to leverage my experience on the research team in my resume. And then also Professor Krause was a reference for me when I was applying to Brookings for an intern. So now I'll kind of go back to what I did after BC. So my senior year, I was in, it sounds like a lot of you are in, like, what am I going to do post BC? And again, I was a philosophy and international studies major, and I just kept having these feelings that my 4 years at BC were spent thinking about abstract ideas so far away from home that it actually pushed me to want the opposite experience, where I wanted something that was grounded in the politics of America today. I graduated a year after Trump was elected, so I was just kind of grappling with where America was sitting on the international stage. And so this experience, it kind of led me to JVC, the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, because it allowed me an experience to kind of pivot if I wanted to pivot. And it gave me a year of a nice cushion before I like entered the real workforce or like went to graduate school, because it is such a supported program that I knew I was going to be surrounded with other like-minded students, other Jesuit graduates. And so I ended up having my placement in Austin, Texas at a workers' rights organization called the Workers' Defense Project. And so that was my first exposure to labor at all. So I was a paralegal representing mainly construction workers and cleaning ladies. And so all my work was in Spanish, which was a big shock to me. And so I spent a year and had never thought about labor policy, never took a labor policy class at BC. And I just found myself so fascinated with the topic and just how interrelated it was. And I think that's why it connects to BC, where I think the international studies major that I had just made me constantly be thinking how everything connects together. And I think that's why I loved and I really like labor policy, is just I think labor connects with every aspect of life in many ways. So then it's still in like this crisis of, I have a philosophy degree, I have an international studies degree. I am kind of like lacking these hard, tangible skills to maybe pivot into think tank world, because I was realizing I liked more of like the high level thinking as opposed to the direct service work as a paralegal at a workers' rights organization. So I started applying like crazy to every think tank position in Washington, D.C., got a lot of no's, a lot more no's, and even more no's. And what ultimately it came to, Brookings internship page kind of like popped up on my website because I had heard of Brookings while I was at BC, and I like leaned on a lot of their research for some of my classes. And there was an internship position opened up that was specifically about the low wage workforce. And I was like, great, I can really tailor my resume. I just spent a year representing low wage workers in Austin, Texas. So I applied for the internship. Professor Krause wrote me a letter of recommendation. I landed the internship. And then from there, I had a 3-month internship, and then it got extended to a 6-month internship. Then they brought me back on to finish this big research project that we're working on. And then the pandemic hit. But at that time, one of the scholars that was in my research program, she was looking for a research assistant because her portfolio blew up. And I had kind of the inside scoop of knowing that she needed a research assistant. And so I applied for her position. And now I've been as a research assistant for almost a year, and with Brookings for about like 18 months. So that's kind of my long spiel. So Mahima, please give me direction. And I actually worked with Mahima on Professor Krause's research team. So all feels full circle right here.
Yeah, Laura was my first partner on the research team. So thank you so much for sharing that. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you approached your job search during your senior year and why you decided that JVC was the right path for you?
Yeah, so talked a little bit about it, of being in the state of just like confusion. And really what led me was wanting an experience that was a buffer and that I didn't feel like I had to like commit fully to something. And it really attracted me to the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, that it was a finite 1-term year. So if I liked labor, I could keep pursuing that. But if I didn't like labor, I could pivot away. And at the time I did JBC, I was really discerning law school. And I thought that this would be a good year to kind of play it out. And again, like a low stakes environment. So I think that's kind of the main reason why I applied. And also BC just sends a lot of kids to the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. BC sends the most students out of any university. So it was also just a popular thing that a lot of my professors talked to me about. So it was just like a really attractive option for being in a state of not knowing what I wanted to do with either of my majors. And it gave me a really good year of work experience.
Great, thank you. And so could you tell us more about your work now at Brookings and the Metropolitan Policy Program and what your research focuses on?
Yeah. To kind of answer that question, I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about the structure of a think tank, because while I was at BC, I didn't really know what think tanks did. I just thought they were like glass boxes where people thought. And actually, I forget who said it, but someone said, maybe it was Carolina, said that you're an English major and an econ major. And, you know, I was coming to find that a lot of people at Brookings are kind of math majors who know how to write, which again is like not the conception that you have of a think tank where you think people are in a box thinking. So how Brookings is structured, and I think a lot of other think tanks are structured like this, is that there's actually 5 think tanks under the letterhead of the Brookings Institution. So there's foreign policy, which really leans on the international studies degrees and majors and whatnot. There's global development, which similarly is a good outlet for IS majors. There's econ, and then there is governance studies, and then there's mine, which is the smallest program at Brookings, and it's called the Metropolitan Policy Program. So we call it Metro for short because it's a mouthful. And so my program is focused on cities, regions, and social and economic inclusion and growth for cities and the people that make up the cities. And so with that, as I kind of briefly said, I work directly for a scholar named Molly Kinder. And our work portfolio is all about the present and future of work. But really that got shaped with COVID, where she kind of designed what her work portfolio was going to be at the start of COVID, because she's focused on the low wage workforce. So right when COVID hit, we started working on essential workers, and especially like low wage essential workers. So a lot of our work the past year has been about hazard pay, which is like temporary pay for hazardous work. It's been a lot about corporate accountability. And just now we're starting to kind of pivot of what has the pandemic meant for like the low wage workforce, and like how is it going to change moving forward. So that's like a little bit of what I do now. But everyone, like of my other colleagues, research assistant colleagues, they all kind of have a certain subject area that they like work on. So like one research assistant like really works with a scholar just on housing policy. Another one just works on infrastructure. And so I'm kind of in a pool of, there's a couple scholars that do workforce development and labor policy. And so I'm one of those, but the scholar I work for is really focused on the low wage worker, and then also having a worker centered portfolio. And that's, I think, where some of my skills from my IS degree came in, is that I didn't need to have as many quantitative skills because she does a lot of qualitative analysis and interviews. And so that's why her work portfolio is a little bit different than some of my other colleagues.
Okay, great. And we have a question from Carolina. So, what does the day at your job look like? Like, if there's a typical day?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as cliche it sounds, like no day is typical, because, well, from two main reasons. One reason is, again, like my work structure of working directly for someone, that if something needs to get done that day, it'll get done that day. And so that can change day to day based on like what is on her mind, what she's thinking. But also every day is different because we like flow like in a research cycle. So how it kind of works is you have to get funding to do research at think tanks. And that's, I think, a big thing that people should know about think tanks, is that you have to get money to do your work. So a big aspect of the job is being able to fundraise and write grants and get people ecstatic about your work so that they'll fund you to do it. So depending on like if we're in the development stage of trying to write grant proposals or just pitch to funders, that looks very different from when we actually land a proposal to do research and we can actually be doing the research. So that kind of looks like what you might be doing at BC, doing a long extended research project. But then there kind of comes the writing stage. Then there becomes the impact stage of where you try to land your research. And a lot of that is not on my plate. It's a lot on my scholars' plate of contacting local leaders, also just major newspapers, and kind of like trying to land our work. So within that cycle, every day kind of looks different. So not very helpful, but I can speak about what like the research days would look like if anyone's curious about that.
Yeah, I would be curious.
So even within that, it varies. A lot of my research portfolio, again, is worker centered. So for example, over the summer, we were doing a lot of interviews with low wage frontline essential workers, whether that be home health aides or grocery workers, janitors. And so we were doing a lot of interviews, but then with that came transcribing the interviews and then doing qualitative analysis to kind of like pick out main themes and see what we were learning from these interviews and what workers actually like needed and wanted during the pandemic to feel protected. And from these interviews is where kind of the idea of hazard pay came up. And so we kind of let that influence our research. So after we get some interviews done, then we try to turn more to like finding the data that we can use to like elevate our points, let's say about hazard pay. So one big project that I worked on quantitatively and qualitatively was a big research endeavor where I tracked the 13 largest retail companies in America and calculated what type of compensation they were giving their low wage workforce during COVID and the type of hazard pay that they're getting. So in that, I got to come up with a methodology of how to track hazard pay, how to track compensation across companies. And so then with that came a lot of data visualization. And so I was just crunching a bunch of numbers from coming up with a methodology on how to calculate hazard pay, but then also tracking like financial information from these companies. So that project looked very Excel heavy for me. But then some other projects are like local hazard pay, because we can't get rid of hazard pay ever, where we were tracking local legislation. So that type of research looks very different, where we were reading like Long Beach, California, they passed like a hazard pay ordinance and we wanted to get smart on what it was. So that research was more of like what I experienced being an international studies major and a philosophy major at BC, of like the qualitative heavy reading, looking up legislation versus kind of the more Excel work.
Great, thank you. I think Professor Krause is heading.
Bye, Professor Krause.
Laura, so it sounds like you've had to learn on the job. Like you've already had a lot of research experience at BC, but then there's like a lot more to learn about your specific topic at Brookings. So how have you found mentors throughout your career to help you with that process?
Well, I think the first two mentors, actually, Professor Owens and then Professor Krause, were two major mentors of mine at BC. And so I think how I kind of found those two mentors was focusing on experiences that you could kind of have like a lot of touch points with a person to like gain a mentorship experience. So I had that with Professor Krause with being on his research team, and then Professor Owens and I studied abroad in South Africa for a class. And so that provided a good experience. But as I positioned of trying to move from Austin, Texas to Washington, DC, I really did rely on the BC network and alum. And so once I landed my internship at Brookings, like I know I took a risk of taking an internship because my parents were like, this is your second year out of college and you're just doing an internship. And I'm like, trust me. So once I got to Brookings, I knew I really had to hustle. And so part of that was reaching out to BC alum at Brookings. And so there's a total of 3 of us now at Brookings. And one of them just like really took me under her wing, and she got me connected. She got me like a side gig of like helping another scholar in a different research program with a book. And she kept me privy to like any job openings that were coming up outside of my research program. So that was a great way to have a mentor. But then I think the structure of Brookings, and I believe a lot of other think tanks, does nicely set you up to have kind of easy access to mentors, where my scholar is like an easy mentor because I spend every day like working with her. So she's a natural scholar. But then also I think think tanks just naturally provide, it's a little different in COVID now, but they provide a lot of like brown bags, we call them, of just like getting on a Zoom or in normal times being around a table of just being able to discuss research. Because I think collegiality is something that's really emphasized in working in public policy and at a think tank. So just taking advantage of any opportunity that you have some people that are doing interesting work like around you at a table. I just found that I try to be bold and like make as many connections as I could, knowing that my internship was like a one shot of maybe landing a job at Brookings. And I think some of that started of like really taking advantage of the water cooler and like just trying to like get to know everyone that I could and go to as many events as I could. Just to kind of have like those like mini touch points with people. And Twitter is like a big way. I don't know if like Twitter is a big thing for you all, but at my stage of career, finding Twitter friends is kind of like a weird phenomenon, but it really is a way of finding like a mentor in a weird sense.
That's wonderful. So you touched on this a little bit, but I was just wondering how your work has changed during COVID and how you deal with things like Zoom fatigue or like just connecting with colleagues, because you mentioned that now the brown bags are like over Zoom and not in person.
Yeah, I think, again, my position, I haven't experienced the Zoom fatigue as much as maybe someone who's more senior than I am at Brookings, where my Zoom fatigue might come in if I have 3 meetings in a day, but that's kind of rare. But I think like the biggest way that my work has changed, I'll start with like the social side is I, as an intern, I like loved being surrounded by just like really smart, passionate other research assistants that really like use this job as not just a way of gaining experience, but like they really came to Brookings because it is a place that has great impact and they really cared about that. And so I just loved working next to and just being able to absorb all the different type of work that people were doing, where like now I don't get as much exposure to what my colleagues are doing because I'm just sitting at my desk on a computer only focused on what I am. So in a social way, that's kind of been the bummer of it almost, of it's less natural to like say, let's get on a Zoom to like just have like a happy hour when like that just naturally came up. From a work perspective, I would just say output has just increased enormously during COVID, where at the end of the year, they came up with a graph that it's almost like we like doubled our publications during COVID, just because again, it seems like there's more time to be doing it because you can always be attached to your desk. And also like the need was for it, where there's just so much like information out there that I think a lot of people turned to like Brookings and other well-known think tanks and organizations to kind of like try to make sense of what's going on in certain areas. So I think in a work sense, it's changed that way of being busier.
Yeah, so you talk about being busy and doubling your output. So how have you found like a work-life balance here?
I think a good way of finding a work-life balance is, I know that some weeks are going to be heavier, just like based on where I am in like the publication phase of pieces. And so I've found peace with like some weeks are going to be crazy and I'm going to be working long hours, but then the weeks after that are going to be a little slower. And so I just like really embrace like those slower days. But yeah, I'm still trying to like work with it and work on it, because your laptop really can follow you anywhere to keep working. So I don't know if I have a good answer, but I really cherish like the slow days, because I know that there will be slow days and I know that there will be busy days, and I know that the busy days come with a lot of reward that like really excites me and energizes me. So I try to lean into that as much as I can.
Okay, great, thank you. So that's pretty much it for my questions. I can open the floor up to anybody. If you have a question, you can either like raise your hand or just like speak out loud.
So as far as like summer activities go, what would be like say I want to like join a think tank post graduation. I'm a sophomore right now. Like what summer activities should I look to do from now until then?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you're really interested in working in a think tank, I would say take advantage of doing a think tank internship if you can, the year going into your summer senior year, or your senior year if you're able to find a balance between doing schoolwork and an internship. Because I think one great thing about COVID is that now all internships are remote, and we've figured out that they can be remote. So Eric, if you're someone that's going to school in Boston and you can't get to like DC that easily, like there are more opportunities at your fingertips to do a remote internship. And I really see that culture kind of staying with think tanks, where I know Brookings has really loved that these internships have allowed us to expand our geographical diversity, as opposed to just like attracting students in the Bosch Wash corridor. And I would say take advantage of remote internships, and like if you can, even doing it during a semester, if that's possible. But I would say besides maybe a think tank internship, I think skills that are really important to develop are, if you want like to work in a think tank, are research skills and writing skills. I would say that's like really big. So if you can show that you have experience like writing heavily, I think that is something that, from someone that has like hired 2 interns now, is the kind of the biggest room for growth are the writing skills. So if you can point to having really good writing experience, whether that be through an internship or just coursework, I think that would put you in a good position.
Thank you.
Marcia, you have a question?
Yes. Thank you, Laura, for sharing your experience. This has been very informative. I just had a question regarding a little bit more your career path. So you were talking about how you did a little bit of paralegal jobs, and interestingly enough, those are like think tank world and paralegal are two roles that I'm very interested in at the moment. So I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about the skills that you would say are transferable between those two types of jobs.
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind is analytical skills, and then just writing skills. And so there's like a common point there. but I would say there's actually like a lot of difference in that I underappreciated how much policy work and think tank roles emphasize quantitative skills. So I think that's something that you would want to balance of when you're applying to both, kind of like weighing what type of like research assistant jobs you'd be applying for, where like there's going to be some that like expect you to either come in with a lot of quantitative skills or learn them on the job. And so that might take you a little bit farther away from kind of balancing like the legal career versus like a master's of public policy degree. But there are like a lot of similarities just like about how you think, what you think about. But again, I just can't emphasize enough, like think tanks really require like data visualization. And I think that's another big learning curve that I learned at Brookings is I always heard like think tanks are like universities without the students. But a big component of that is your audience is also different, where, you know, Professor Owens as a professor, he has to read your papers where, well, he doesn't have to, but, you know, he does, and he gives them a grade. Where at think tanks, your output is try to attract people. And so with that really comes with creative graphics, creative data visualization, and just creative thinking. And so that's a different skill set than like being a lawyer or being a paralegal that is just so objective and by the books, where like a research assistant, it forces you to push boundaries. And so if you can find like a position that can like work within those two, but I don't think that they are, sometimes they get looped in together, but I don't think that they are actually that similar. Where I found the work that as a paralegal I was doing required a very different mindset than like trying to think creatively about how to make people want to click on a piece, which is not your experience in as being a paralegal or anything in the legal. Like you aren't trying to attract people to your work, let's say.
Carolina.
Hello. Yeah, it was really awesome to hear your experiences and your journey. I love super non-linear like journeys that are kind of like, I don't know, interesting stories that are and this was a very inspirational one, I think, for me. So thank you. I'm wondering, what are like the biggest things that JVC taught you about yourself? And what skills do you find yourself using at your current job that were like unexpected to you? That like are unexpected to me too.
I'll start with the second one, where a big takeaway that I got from JVC, just from my placement of being a paralegal at a worker center, is that I was constantly interacting with workers in the community who had legal complaints, filing discrimination, or wage theft. And I think having those interactions with people and like learning from their experience really further motivated me of why I think labor policy is really important. And so in the position that I'm doing, I think JVC gave me like a sense of empathy and like how to actually think about real life problems that like would come up when we think about the low wage workforce, where oftentimes labor and workforce and whatnot is thought through the mind of an economist. And I think sometimes it's helpful that like I've had the experience of like really rooted in workers and like their experience. And that has really translated to like how I interact on my work, where like I do a lot of interviews and it kind of brings me back. Now, luckily I can do the interviews in English as opposed to Spanish, but I think like that sense of like always trying to find a point of connection and like pull out kind of the wisdom that these workers are sharing with us during COVID, because they like really are the experts of like what the low wage workforce looks right now. What does it look like to be working in COVID right now? And so I think JVC really gave me empathy and like pushed me beyond my boundaries. And I think that's another good plug for JVC, is that the placements that want to have a Jesuit volunteer are a place that like need a Jesuit volunteer, or like don't have a lot of resources. So just the skill development that you're able to get in a year was crazy. Like just the amount of responsibility that was put on me being first year out of college, not being fluent in Spanish, but like I was given a caseload to like own and be in charge of. And so I think I was able to kind of like point to a lot of my experiences like on my resume. And I like really appreciate just how much I was pushed my first year out of Boston College into the workforce. And I think like just other social skills, JVC is not for the faint of heart. And I think the thing that I found most challenging, which I did not expect, was the aspect of community living. So like if you're interested of doing like international like work as well, where I did not expect it to be hard to like live in community, because I'm like, oh, like I went to BC, I had roommates, but the thought of like sharing pooled resources like oftentimes created a lot of tension in our house. And so I think I gained a lot of like the soft skills maybe from that experience of like how to negotiate to get yogurt like a week using our like money. So like there's like little skills like that that like are painful in real time, but again, it kind of goes back to some of the soft skills and social skills that I think BC like does an amazing job of already like teaching students, but like JVC like really like made me confront conflict like head on. And again, like I think that's like good experience heading into the workforce of like, I may not be fighting over yogurt, but like we might be fighting over different ideas of how to take like a research question or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it should be said though that you did have many years of Spanish under your belt before you did this.
Yes.
You were a Spanish speaker. You just weren't. You're not calling yourself fluent appropriately, but you just were forced into it quickly, as if you were, needing to speak that full time, right?
And like labor law in Spanish, like learning all of like construction terms in Spanish. Like I never learned those in a classroom. So there was a lot of things like on the workplace that these workers would be doing. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to learn what excavator is in Spanish. So kind of those vocabulary words.
Yeah, I guess, as the ethics and social justice professor here, I have to ask you a question that you and I have actually talked about a lot, but before you graduated, and that's, looking back the past couple of years, how have your values been challenged or affirmed in the past couple of years? It's something you put a lot of thought into as a student. A couple of years out now, looking back, yeah, how have they been challenged and where have they been affirmed?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the biggest way that they've been affirmed, and I've been thinking a lot about this recently, of moving forward in my career, who do I want like my consumer to be almost, or output to be, where I've noticed just from having a sister that works for like a private company, like having a lot of people around me work for private for-profit companies, of like their accountability and their responsibilities are for a customer and a consumer, and like how that just shapes their lifestyle, like even like their flow of the day of like when and how that they're on call, and like the type of responsibilities that come with like working for like a for-profit company versus where I am now realizing the value that I'm now appreciating the value of working for a nonprofit, of like my output is like a public good, and that looks very different. Like my output is for the bottom line of a company or for a customer. And I like that from like the social aspect of it, or like the social good aspect. But I also kind of like it for the values I hold personally. Like creativity is a value that is really important to me, and something that I have loved about my job is that I'm able to be creative every day and like think of creative ways to think and come up with ideas and write, because I don't really have like a bottom line to think about, or I don't have a CEO to like push back against. Like I just feel a lot of creative liberty and liberty of thought of working at a nonprofit. And so I think it would be a big shift for me of maybe going the more corporate route that doesn't prioritize that thing and recognizes that the purpose of a corporation is your profit. And that's very different than like the purpose of my research is impact for society. So does that answer your question, Professor Owens?
Oh, of course. It's great. I appreciate it.
All right, so if no one else has any more questions, Laura, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. This was really helpful for me, and I'm sure for everyone else who attended. You've done some amazing things in just a couple of years, and there's so much to be learned from your experiences. And I was just wondering if anybody wants to reach out to you to connect, or if they have any further questions, how can they go about that?
Mahime, you have my personal email. You can feel free to share that with anyone. And yeah, I would just encourage, as no matter what stage you are in kind of thinking about your career, find an organization that you find interesting and see if there's BC alum there. Because speaking for me personally, like on LinkedIn, like I get a lot of like requests of informational interviews, and I only accept the ones from BC because it's also to my advantage to have more people from BC in the think tank space. So I bet a lot of other BC alum feel the same way, that they are happy to give 15 minutes if you have questions, just because I think understanding like the structure of an organization and like the day-to-day life is really helpful to make you think of if this is a position that you would want or career if you want, but also like if you would want to apply. I think having some background knowledge on like the structure of the organization just makes you sound more in the know in your application and makes you look more competitive. So that was a long-winded answer, but you can share my personal email.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So everyone, thank you so much for coming. Enjoy the nice day outside as much as is left. And Laura, thank you so much for coming. You're in Florida, so you could be outside. Relax. This means a lot. So.
I don't want to be outside because it's Florida, so I'm happy inside.